There are some wars that leave ashes, and others that leave scars carved into the very fabric of memory. When the Dark Eldar descend upon a world, they do not conquer as other foes do. They do not claim territory, nor seek banners raised in triumph. They come as shadows that fall without warning, tearing apart everything that breathes, laughs, or prays beneath alien skies. For the Imperium, the sight of their blade ships drifting from the void is not merely a herald of death. It is the promise of something worse, an agony so profound that the soul itself begins to fracture. There are few terrors whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy more dreadful than the raids of the Drukhari. To witness their work is to understand that pain itself can be weaponized, woven into chains, sharpened into knives, unleashed as an art form of cruelty. This is not a tale of simple slaughter. This is the story of how the Dark Eldar inflict fear across entire planets, and why their name lingers as a curse on every world they touch. If you wish to delve deeper into the hidden horrors of the galaxy, to uncover the shadows the Imperium dares not speak of, then remain with us. Like, share, and subscribe, so that the chronicles of this darkness may never be forgotten. The first sign was not fire, nor blade, nor blood. It was silence. The kind of silence that does not soothe, but on the agri world of Thavros Secundus, where fields of wheat stretched endless beneath the pale sun, the people spoke in hushed tones long before the first raid. Harvest had been plentiful, the granaries full, yet the air itself seemed wrong. Livestock began to scatter in the night, bellowing at empty fields. Vox channels flickered with half-formed echoes, strange static that mimicked the cadence of human speech before dissolving into nothing. Children woke screaming from dreams they could not describe, their small hands clutching their throats as though warding off invisible blades in the void above. The Auspex crews of the orbital defense stations reported anomalies, small readings, faint shadows at the edge of detection, dismissed at first as drifting asteroids or fragmentary echoes from the gas giant's rings. Yet when charted across nights, the anomalies formed patterns, curves that bent against the natural flow of the system, shadows that returned to the same coordinates as though circling prey. Officers filed their reports to command, but the scribes who received them marked them as unconfirmed. Even then, unease spread in whispers, a dread not born of proof, but of instinct. On the ground, the people did what humanity always does when unease grows. They told stories. Some spoke of orc warbands gathering beyond the trade lanes. Others muttered of genestealer cults, or necron tombs stirring beneath the soil. But the oldest among them remembered tales from the fringes of the galaxy, of raiders who descended without banners, without demands, leaving only suffering in their wake. The word Drukhari was rarely spoken, for even uttering it was believed to invite notice. Instead, they called them the Shadowkin, or simply them. The fear of naming became the first chain the invaders would fasten around the planet's heart. The governor of Thavros, Secundus, dismissed the unease. To him, the voices of farmers and miners carried little weight. His confidence was not arrogance, but the learned faith of all who served the Imperium, that the Astra Militarum would answer if danger came, that the God-Bemperor's gaze rested upon the faithful. He ordered prayers at the cathedral spires, not realizing that even the adepts chanting the litanies did so with a faltering cadence. For though the Aquila banners still fluttered in the wind itself had grown cold. Night after night, the dreams worsened. Whole hablocks stirred awake, screaming at the same hour, as though sharing a single nightmare. Witnesses swore they saw figures at the edge of the field stall silhouettes, their outlines too sharp, their movements too fluid to be mistaken for men. Patrols dispatched to investigate found nothing but trampled soil and a scent of ozone. The temps of weapons, discharging in places where no weapon had fired. Fear deepened, not because the enemy was seen, but because they remained unseen. The people began to understand that something was already among them. In the command spire, adepts pored over Uzbek's data. One described the anomalies as shadows cast where there should be no light. Another noted that the patterns moved with intention, too precise to be natural. Some believed it was the work of pirates or Xenos smugglers testing defenses. Yet, beneath their arguments ran a current of dread. The Vox recordings were played back in empty rooms, and listeners swore they heard the faint laughter of children woven into the static. Others claimed to hear whispers in a tongue not meant for human throats. The adepts worked longer shifts, but many refused to remain alone at their consoles. Even in the sanctity of the data halls, fear gnawed like hunger. The first disappearance came quietly. A patrol of 6, sent to monitor the valley ridges, failed to return. Their transponders blinked briefly before vanishing into silence. At dawn, the next patrol found only their lost rifles, neatly arranged in the dirt, still warm to the touch, as though freshly gripped. No blood, no tracks, no bodies. The governor declared it a desertion and had their names erased from records as cowards. But among the people, this only confirmed their worst fears. For the Drukhari did not always announce themselves with firestorms. Sometimes they came like a sickness, plucking souls one by one, until only silence remained. By now, even the air felt poisoned. Winds carried scents that did not belong: burnt metal, bitter oils, and a sweetness that turned the stomach. Crops began to blacken in patches, though no disease was found. Livestock bore wounds like shallow cuts, not fatal, but placed with deliberate cruelty. Some were left blind, their eyes carved out, as though for amusement. These acts were not warfare. They were the preludes of terror, signs that the hunters were near, and that they already walked unseen among the living. The ecclesiarchy called for mass prayers at the Grand Cathedral, and thousands gathered beneath the emperor's gaze. They raised voices in hymns, but their voices cracked and trembled. In the back rows, some swore they felt unseen hands brushing their shoulders, or cold breath on their necks. The high confessor declared such feelings the testing of faith. Yet even he paused when the stained glass depictions of saints seemed to shiver, as if the glass itself remembered pain. And so the silence deepened. Every night, more lights flickered in the sky, ships glimpsed and then gone. Every day, more rumors spread of figures glimpsed in mirrors, of children who spoke words they did not know, of Uzbek's readings that spelled out symbols no one dared translate. The planet had not yet been struck, but it was already conquered. Fear had hollowed the hearts of its people, preparing them for chains that had not yet closed. The truth of the Drukhari is this: they do not simply arrive. They unfold themselves like shadows lengthening at dusk, so that by the time their blades are seen, the spirit of resistance is already broken. On Thavros' Secundus, the silence before the storm became the storm itself. Fear grew heavier than iron, sharper than steel. By the time the first raider descended through the clouds, the people already belonged to them. When the storm finally broke, it did not come with thunder, but with a shriek that split the sky. The first raiders descended at dawn, slicing through the low clouds like blades. Their ships were sleek, angular constructs, gliding with predatory silence until they chose to roar. Engines whined with unnatural tones, like a choir of tortured voices, and from their hulls poured the warriors of Commorragh. They did not march as soldiers, nor advance as armies. They flowed like a tide of steel and shadow, each figure a silhouette of barbed armor and cruelty sharpened into form. The first city struck was Corvath's Landing, a mining hub of 30,000 souls. Its Vox towers crackled with desperate warnings, even as the first skimmers cut across its avenues. Dark Eldar warriors leaped from their raiders with impossible grace, their movements too fast, too precise, as if the air itself bent to their cruelty. Splinter fire burst into the crowd streams of crystalline shards that did not simply pierce flesh, but shredded it, leaving victims writhing as toxins burned through veins. Screams erupted, and in that moment, the city ceased to be a place of life. It became a hunting ground. The defenders tried to respond. PDF squads raised their lasguns, their voices breaking as they recited litanies of aim and fire. But volleys of red light were nothing against the raiders' speed. The Drukhari moved between the beams, their armor catching the sun like black glass. They struck with blades that curved like serpents, each swing taking not just life, but dignity. A soldier impaled on a glaive was lifted, spun, and cast aside as if the act itself was an art piece. To fight the Drukhari was to realize too late that they had not come to be resisted. They had come to harvest. Skimmers darted low over the streets, chains dragging behind them, hooks lashing into fleeing civilians. Men, women, and children were dragged screaming into the air, their hands clawing at stone and soil until they were torn away. Some were snatched whole, others left broken on the ground, their bodies severed by barbed steel. In every act was deliberation. The Drukhari did not kill quickly unless it amused them. They wounded, they maimed, they left survivors alive long enough to scream so that others would hear. Fear was not collateral, it was the point. The air itself grew thick with it, vox channels filled with desperate. Behind, fear spread faster than the raiders themselves, racing ahead into cities not yet touched. Refugees carried stories, their eyes wide, their words fractured. Some swore the Drukhari were demons made flesh, their faces shifting beneath their helms, their voices whispering in dreams. Others spoke of laughter, sharp and mocking, that carried on the wind long after the raiders had departed. For those who survived, a truth settled in. The Drukhari did not need to kill everyone. They only needed to take enough to break the soul of a planet. And so the harvest spread, each raid leaving behind not just ruins, but the echo of terror that promised more to come. On Thavros Secundus, hope did not die in a single moment. It was drained, piece by piece, scream by scream, until the very act of drawing breath became a prelude to chains. The harvest had begun, and there would be no end until the raiders themselves chose to vanish, carrying their victims into a darkness deeper than the void. The harvest did not end with capture. It only deepened. Those torn from the surface of Thavros Secundus soon realized that death had been the mercy denied to them. Shackled in the bellies of barbed vessels, they were stripped not only of freedom, but of identity. Chains of serrated metal bound their wrists, cutting deeper with every twitch, so that movement itself became punishment. The holds were cramped, filled with the stench of blood, sweat, and poison-scented oils that clung to the air. Darkness was not absence, but suffocation, pierced by the occasional flash of pale witchlight that revealed faces twisted in silent screams. Prisoners tried at first to speak to one another, to cling to the threads of shared humanity, but the Drukhari understood this instinct too well. They prowled the cages, taloned fingers brushing along bars, selecting one voice at random, a question, a plea, a sobi. Any sound was enough. Victims were dragged out, never to return, their absence leaving only silence. Soon, the captives learned that even words were dangerous. In that silence, despair grew fertile. Men and women huddled in corners, clutching themselves, unable to trust even the comfort of another's gaze. Fear was not merely enforced, it was cultivated, like a crop tended for the cruelest harvest. When the ships returned to Commorragh, the captives were unloaded into holding pens beneath skies, unlike any mortal world. The city stretched like a nightmare, its towers of black spires and jagged glass blotting out what should have been stars. Poisoned air filled their lungs, and every breath carried a taste of ash and iron. Light itself seemed corrupted, shadows bending in ways that unsettled the mind, colors bleeding where they should not exist. Even before the torment began, the very environment wore at sanity, breaking the fragile barriers of perception. In the pens, victims saw what awaited them. The Drukhari did not hide their craft. They displayed it, glorified it, ensuring that terror began long before blades touched flesh. Captives were lined along walkways where they could see arenas below, where those taken earlier were made examples. Warriors in barbed armor danced around them, cutting not to kill, but to prolong. Splinter rounds laced with toxins left bodies twitching for hours. Flesh was peeled in strips, nerves plucked as if they were harpstrings. The screams echoed through the chambers, carried upward so every soul could hear. This was not brutality for efficiency. It was theater, an art form where agony was the only language. Fear in the pens changed shape. It was no longer the fear of dying, but of not dying, of living too long, of being seen, of being chosen. Every moment stretched into torment, for every sound in the corridors might be the approach of a tormentor. Some captives prayed to the Emperor, whispering half-remembered hymns until their throats were raw. Others renounced faith entirely, convinced that no god could hear them here. A few laughed, broken already, their minds fracturing in the attempt to shield themselves from what they witnessed. The Drukhari fed on this collapse. Homunculi moved among the cages, their forms twisted by centuries of vile artistry. Their voices were soft, almost tender, as they studied their subjects. They did not speak threats. They spoke promises of pain yet to come, of artistry yet to be unveiled. They allowed prisoners to imagine their own fates, knowing imagination was often crueler than reality. Victims began to dream of their deaths, only to wake and find themselves still alive. Their nightmares merely prelude to waking horror. Those chosen for torment often returned, but changed beyond recognition. Limbs bent at wrong angles, eyes replaced with glimmering shards, skin stitched into patterns no sane hand would design. They were paraded before their fellows, forced to move, to scream, to exist as living proof of what awaited. The survivors looked upon them and realized that fear was no longer external. It lived inside, fed by every sight and sound, growing until it devoured hope itself. Some captives resisted, clinging to defiance even as chains cut into their flesh. These were broken differently. The Drukhari did not need to kill the body to crush the soul. They isolated the defiant, depriving them of sight, sound, or touch for endless spans of time. When they were finally returned to the pens, they emerged hollow, unable to speak, unable to recognize their own names. Others were forced to harm their fellow captives, compelled by torment to become instruments of cruelty themselves. The Drukhari reveled in this corruption, for it proved that even the strongest could be reshaped into tools of despair. Among the captives, rumors began to spread. Some whispered that the Drukhari consumed souls, that every scream was a fragment of eternity ripped from the victim and devoured. Others claimed that those who suffered the longest became eternal echoes in Commorragh, their agony woven into the very stones of the city. Whether true or not, the belief alone was enough to fracture minds. The captives began to see their chains not as iron, but as sentences without end. The cruelty of the Drukhari was not random. It was precise. Every act was calculated to turn fear inward, to make the prisoners destroy themselves long before a blade touched them. And when at last a captive begged for death, pleaded for release, the tormentors would smile behind their helms. For in that moment, the harvest was complete. Fear had not only been inflicted, it had been perfected. In the pens beneath the poisoned skies, time ceased to matter. Days and nights blurred into one endless scream, one endless silence, one endless weight pressing down on every soul. The captives learned the final truth of the Drukhari, that fear is not the absence of hope, but its inversion. It is the realization that hope itself is the weapon by which the soul is broken. And so, under the gaze of their captors, the weight of the chains did not merely bind their bodies, it bound their very selves, until nothing remained but hollow vessels waiting for the next act of cruelty. The Drukhari professed no worship of gods. They spit upon the dark pantheon, denying them their due, even as they drink from the same poisoned chalice. Yet every raid, Every harvest spills more than mortal blood. It spills into the Imperium itself, staining the currents of the warp with echoes of torment. To those cursed with psychic sight, the passage of a raiding fleet is not a shadow in the void, but a wound that will not close. Screams ripple outward, carried along the tides, lingering far longer than the victims themselves. It is said that when the Drukhari reap too deeply, entire systems feel their presence without ever seeing a single ship. On Thavros Secundus, the captured psychers were the first to sense it. Shackled in null collars, their sight smothered but never silenced, they trembled as the harvest spread. They whispered that the air itself was changing, that threads of agony stretched into infinity. Some cried out that they saw souls torn apart, not ending, but unraveling into strands of raw suffering drifting through the warp. One, driven beyond coherence, begged his fellow captives to close their ears, insisting that the screams did not stop when throats were severed. They only grew louder, reverberating through eternity. Word of these visions spread, even to those without psychic sensitivity. Rumor became a contagion, carried from cage to cage, then back to the surface by those who escaped or claimed to. Survivors spoke of laughter that echoed in their minds long after silence fell, of shadows moving in their dreams that did not belong to memory. Whole villages awoke screaming from terrors they had not seen, clutching one another in fear of raids that had not yet come. Fear became a second harvest, self-perpetuating, requiring no blade to sustain it. The mere knowledge of the Drukhari's existence was enough to poison nights and fracture days in the wider Imperium. Astropaths whispered of systems where distress calls rang out but bore no coordinates, only broken hymns and weeping. Some claimed to have received vox fragments of voices long dead, their pain transmitted across centuries by the warp itself. Navigators described currents fouled by invisible oil. Great patches of Imperium where the Astronomicon dimmed, not from distance, but from interference. Though such reports could not be confirmed, they spread like wildfire, creating pockets of dread where none had existed before. It was not the scale of the Drukhari's raids that made them infamous, it was their persistence in memory. The Imperium reflects mortal emotion, amplifies it, distorts it, and fear, when concentrated, is among the most powerful currents of all. The Drukhari's cruelty may not serve the dark gods directly, but it feeds the same tides. Scholars of forbidden lore whisper that every raid, every scream, leaves weaker minds into madness. And yet, because the Drukhari rejects worship, they wield this power not as priests, but as artists. To them, it is not theology, it is spectacle. They bend the warp without bowing to it, shaping echoes of horror like a sculptor molds clay. Among the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, there are whispered warnings. Never allow an astropath to link minds with one who has seen Commorragh. Too many times, such contact has left both shattered, babbling in voices not their own. Some report that the screams cling like parasites, whispering even after the connection is severed, filling dreams with visions of cages, blades, and skies that bleed colors not meant for mortal sight. Whether these are true transmissions from the warp, or madness seeded by rumor, no one can say, but the effect is the same. Entire orders of psychers live in dread, fearing that their very gift will betray them to shadows they cannot fight. Rumors spread further still. On distant frontier worlds, mothers hush their children with warnings that if they cry too loudly, the shadowkin will hear. In the hives of industrial planets, whispers tell of captives returned, not whole, but as living conduits of fear, their very presence enough to sour milk, crack glass, and rot food. Some tales claim these unfortunates carry echoes of Commorragh inside them, their souls fractured, leaking agony into reality. The Administratum dismisses such reports as superstition, yet even its clerks write faster when such names appear on data slates, as if to be rid of them quickly. The greatest horror is not that the Drukhari strike, it is that they might return. A world once raided, lives forever with that shadow. Survivors glance to the skies whenever clouds gather, wondering if those sleek ships will once more emerge. The mere possibility becomes enough to alter culture, to shape prayers, to twist the future. Children grow into adults haunted by screams they never heard, raising their own children in silence, teaching them to stay hidden, to never draw attention. Fear passes down bloodlines, generation to generation. A curse more enduring than any physical wound. Among the Imperial Guard, soldiers who have fought Drukhari raids carry scars deeper than battlefield wounds. They speak in hushed tones of enemies who cannot be caught, of comrades dragged into the sky, screaming, of nightmares that bleed into waking hours. Regiments touched by such encounters often develop reputations for unease, whispered about even by their allies. Some commanders refuse to deploy them again, fearing that fear itself is infectious, spreading through ranks faster than any contagion. And still, in the darkness of the galaxy, the warp trembles. Each act of cruelty leaves ripples that no sanction can erase. Even the Astartes, forged to know no fear, acknowledge the potency of the Drukhari's harvest, not for the strength of their arms, but for the weight of the shadow they leave behind. It is said that fear carried in the warp lingers longer than light, that it can outlast even the stars themselves. Thus, when a world is raided, its suffering does not end with chains or fire. It spills outward, unseen, unheard, yet deeply felt. Systems untouched whisper, as though haunted. Psychers convulse at shadows no one else perceives, and across the galaxy, hearts beat faster in dread of a name few dare to speak. The Drukhari do not need shrines, temples, or idols. Their worship is written in fear, and the warp itself is their unwilling scribe. When the Drukhari finally departed from Thavros Sakut, they left no banners, no proclamations, no remnants of their presence, save for silence. But silence, in the aftermath of their harvest, was no blessing. It was absence. Streets once alive with trade and laughter stood hollow, their stones stained with blood and shadow. Smoke drifted above the husks of buildings, curling into the sky like the remnants of unspoken prayers. And though the skies had cleared of raiders, every survivor looked upward with the same hollow expectation that at any moment, the nightmare might descend again. The survivors emerged slowly from their hiding places, stumbling into the open as though fearing their own footsteps would summon back the hunters. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, not with tears but with a vacancy that spoke of something taken from them that could never be returned. Families reunited with fewer members. Children called for parents who would never answer. Entire communities gathered in plazas that once held markets, only to stand in silence, unable to speak because words themselves felt fragile. The devastation was not measured in ruins alone, it lived in the people. Men and women walked as though their bodies were intact, but their souls had been hollowed. Even those who had not been chained or dragged into the sky bore scars invisible to the eye. They had seen their kin taken, their defenders broken, their faith silenced, and in that vision, they learned the cruelest truth. Survival was not victory. Survival was burden. They carried memories heavier than stone, heavier than any monument, pressing upon them with every breath. The administratum would later catalog the destruction as a raid of moderate severity. Thousands taken, thousands slain, infrastructure partially recoverable. To the clerks at distant desks, it was another line in a ledger, another statistic in the endless accounting of imperial suffering. But to those who remained, it was not numbers. It was names, names of fathers, mothers, children, lovers, swallowed into the dark and never returned. Each name whispered became an open wound, each memory a cut that never closed. Fear became their inheritance. It seeped into their songs, their rituals, their prayers. Festivals once filled with joy became muted, every celebration shadowed by remembrance. Parents taught their children not to sing too loudly, not to wander far from home, not to look too long at the sky. Even generations unborn would inherit this dread, taught from cradle stories of the Shadowkin, whispered warnings of ships that might one day return. The raid had lasted hours, but its shadow stretched into centuries. The ecclesiarchy sent preachers to restore faith. They spoke of the Emperor as eternal vigilance of the strength of humanity, of defiance in the face of darkness. Yet, even as they spoke, their voices trembled, for they too had walked the streets of silence, seen the vacant stares of survivors, felt the weight of absence that no sermon could lift. Faith persisted, but it was faith bent by fear, faith recited in whispers, as though even prayer might draw unwanted ears. Across the Imperium, whispers of Thavros Secundus spread. Refugees carried stories with them to other systems, and those stories grew heavier in the telling. Each world added its own layer of dread, its own superstitions, to guard against the Drukhari. Some forbade the mention of their name altogether, calling them only the Shadowkin. Others built shrines of silence, places where no word could be spoken, in hopes of warding off attention, and so the fear endured. Long after the raiders themselves had vanished into the void, the Astartes and the Guard could battle orcs, Tyranids, and even the corrupted hosts of chaos. They could rally to banners, draw strength from defiance, raise weapons in the name of survival. But against the Drukhari, there was no battlefield, no warfront to fortify. They struck like shadows and departed as shadows, leaving behind nothing to fight but memory. And memory is a war no army can win. On Thavros Secundus, survivors built monuments to their lost. Stones carved with names stood in the plazas, tall as cathedrals, but even these monuments could not contain the grief. For each name carved, there were dozens unknown, swallowed into Commorragh's endless hunger. The monuments became places, not of closure, but of contagion. Every glance at them, a reminder, every prayer whispered beside them, a reopening of the wound. Yet to tear them down would be worse, for then the fear would have no vessel, no form. It would drift unchecked, like smoke through generations. Children grew into adulthood beneath these shadows. They inherited not the memory of the raid itself, but the weight of its aftermath. They lived in cities rebuilt, yet never whole, worked fields that seemed emptier for the voices missing, prayed in cathedrals where hymns faltered. For them, the Drukhari were not an enemy of history. They were an enemy of inheritance, shaping lives long after their departure. And every parent, every elder, carried the same unspoken dread that one day the raiders would return. The truth of the Drukhari is not only in their cruelty, nor even in the lives they steal. It is in the mark they leave upon those who survive. They do not simply take by, they take futures, twisting them into legacies of silence and fear. A world raided once is never whole again. Its people carry the curse in their blood, in their songs, in the way they look to the skies with unease, even on clear days. The Dark Eldar's name becomes more than a memory, it becomes a weight. And so it is said, to encounter them once is to never be free of them again. Their name lingers on every tongue that dares whisper it, a curse that echoes across generations. Worlds may rebuild, faith may be restored, but beneath it all lies the certainty that the shadows are not gone. They wait, they hunger, and one day they will return.